The courtroom buzzes. It's not the roar of a stadium crowd, nor the hubbub of a marketplace. This sound is far more menacing. It's the sound of democracy turned predatory. 501 voices, 501 hearts, beating in unison with a thirst for conviction. The year is 399 BC. At the center of this hurricane, on the stone floor of the Athenian court, stands a man of 70. His face seems carved from the same marble as the temples on the Acropolis. This is Socrates. His deep-set, satyr-like eyes show no fear, no pleading. There is only a shadow of irony, that very intellectual spark that ignited a fire of hatred in the hearts of his fellow citizens. Around him, a world of contrasts. Bright Attic sunlight, breaking through the columns, casting harsh shadows on the faces of the jurors. Farmers, potters, merchants, veterans of a lost war. Their hands, accustomed to the sword and the oar, now hold bronze tokens for voting. They are the embodiment of Athens, the city that gave the world the Parthenon and the tragedies of Sophocles, but is now poised to commit its most shameful act. The central dramatic paradox is already here, in this heated air, thick with sweat and the premonition of blood. The wisest man in Greece, as proclaimed by the Pythia at Delphi, stands one step away from a death sentence, accused of corrupting the youth. It is precisely for this, for his dialogues, his endless whys, his quest to lay truth bare, that they want to kill him. The main question arises not from the accusers, but from this silent confrontation between the sage and the crowd. How? How did the city of reason reach a point where wisdom became a crime, and a philosopher an enemy of the people? The answer is not just the story of one trial. It is an autopsy on the soul of a civilization, one that has seen its triumph and now stands on the verge of its decline. Every word spoken here, every drop of sweat, every angry glance, will become part of a legend that will haunt the Western world forever. To understand how Athens, the beacon of civilization, could turn its anger on a philosopher, you must breathe the city's air. It is saturated not with the scent of olive groves, but with the stench of ash and defeat. The golden age of Pericles was nothing more than a sweet memory, a myth fathers told their disillusioned sons. We are at the very end of the 5th century BC, and Athens is a shadow of its former glory. 27 years of a grueling, fratricidal Peloponnesian war with Sparta had drained the treasury, destroyed a generation of men, and worst of all, broken the city's spirit. The city that once ruled the seas had endured the unthinkable, a crushing defeat, a humiliating surrender, the tearing down of its long walls to the sound of Spartan flutes. This was immediately followed by the short but bloody terror of the 30 tyrants, a pro-Spartan oligarchy that stained the streets with the blood of dissenters. And although democracy had been restored just a year before Socrates' trial, it was sick. This was not the confident, generous democracy of the Marathon era. It was a fragile, paranoid, hysterical system, suffering from post-traumatic stress. It saw enemies everywhere, in dissent, in new ideas, in anyone who dared to question the traditional foundations that seemed the last bastion of stability. The city desperately needed a scapegoat, a simple explanation for its troubles. Why had the gods turned away from Athens? Who was to blame for the new generation growing up cynical and unprincipled? In this atmosphere of suspicion, anyone who stood out, who went against the grain, who made people think instead of believe, became a suspect. Socrates, with his eternal questions, his merciless exposure of the ignorance of the powerful, was not just an irritant. In the eyes of these frightened people, he looked like a symptom of the disease, an intellectual virus eating away at the last remnants of Athenian virtue. His trial was not an act of justice, it was an act of collective psychotherapy, an attempt by a sick society to heal itself by cutting out the part that made it feel the pain of self-knowledge. In this theater of aristocrats and politicians, Socrates was an outsider, a man who literally came from stone. His father, Sophroniscus, was a sculptor or stonemason, a man whose hands gave shape to inanimate matter. His mother, Phanerete, was a midwife, helping new life enter the world. These two images, stone and birth, would become key metaphors for his entire life and philosophy. He did not belong to the noble families who traced their lineage to mythical heroes. He was a man of the Athenian agora, the noisy, dusty, crowded square where merchants, artisans, philosophers, and demagogues mixed. His appearance, by all accounts, was far from the classical ideal. Short, paunchy, with a wide, flat nose and bulging eyes, he looked more like a Silenus or a satyr, a forest spirit, than a sage. But this ungainly shell concealed a mind as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. He inherited his father's skill for working with material. Only his material was not marble blocks, but human souls, from which he tried to chisel the contours of truth. And from his mother, he took the art of maieutics, intellectual midwifery. Socrates claimed he taught nothing. His own knowledge was empty. Like a midwife, he only helped a person give birth to the truth they were already pregnant with, but could not deliver on their own. This method was revolutionary and dangerous. It implied that knowledge was not a commodity to be passed from teacher to student, but an inner state, achieved through the painful process of self-examination and the shedding of false opinions. In a society where knowledge was a privilege and a tool of power, a man who claimed truth was accessible to anyone willing to undergo intellectual labor was undermining the very foundations of the hierarchy. He was an anomaly, a commoner who spoke of virtue better than the aristocrats, an ugly man who spoke of beauty, a poor man who despised money. This combination of being of the people and yet an intellectual elitist made him doubly dangerous and incomprehensible to the Athenian establishment. If his origins made him an outsider, one event turned his life into a sacred mission, divinely ordained. It was not a vision or a revelation in the traditional sense. It was an answer received from the very heart of the Hellenic religion. From Delphi, where the priestess of Apollo, the Pythia, delivered her cryptic will. The story, as told by Socrates himself at his trial, is that his eager friend and admirer Chaerephon went to the sanctuary and asked the oracle a simple, bold question. Is anyone in the world wiser than Socrates? The Pythia's answer was as concise as it was fateful. No one. Upon hearing this, Socrates, by his own account, was baffled. He, who knew only one thing, that he knew nothing, was called the Wisest. This was his turning point, a prophecy he had to either disprove or decipher. He took the god's words not as a compliment, but as a riddle, a divine assignment. From that day, his life became a relentless investigation. He began his famous circuit of Athens, his odyssey through the souls of his fellow citizens. He went to politicians, considered wise and governing, to poets, whose tragedies seemed to grasp human passion, to artisans, whose hands created perfect things. And to each he asked simple questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is good? And each time the result was the same. Behind the facade of confidence and authority, he found only confusion, contradiction, and arrogant ignorance. The politician could not define justice. The poet could not explain his inspiration. The artisan, an expert in his craft, believed himself wise in all other matters. Thus, Socrates solved the oracle's riddle. His wisdom lay not in possessing knowledge, but in being aware of his lack of it. He was wiser than others only because he knew nothing, while they, knowing nothing, were certain they knew everything. But this discovery had a dark side. By becoming a divine inspector of human souls, he transformed from a mere eccentric philosopher into a living reproach to the entire city. His mission from Apollo became, in the eyes of the Athenians, his personal arrogance and his search for wisdom, a systematic humiliation of authority. The forge of his character, the place where his unique philosophical weapon was honed, was not the quiet gardens of the academy, but the dusty, noisy, teeming streets of Athens. His battlefield was the agora, his opponents, anyone who considered themselves an expert. His method, which would go down in history as the elenchus, was a form of intellectual guerrilla warfare. He didn't give lectures, write treatises, or create doctrines. Instead, he would approach a man, be it the famed General Laches or the pious seer Euthyphro, and begin with an innocent, almost flattering question, asking to be taught, to have the essence of something, like courage or piety, explained to him. The man, flattered and confident, would readily offer a definition, and then the deadly game would begin. Socrates, feigning ignorance, would start asking clarifying questions, one after another, each seemingly harmless. But like a skilled hunter, he slowly, step by step, backed his prey into a logical corner. He would show that the definition contradicted the man's other beliefs, that it failed to hold up against specific examples, that it crumbled to dust under the slightest analysis. The end result was a state of aporia, complete intellectual paralysis, where the man was forced to admit he did not know the very thing he was certain he knew. For Socrates, this was a positive moment, the first step toward true knowledge, realizing one's own ignorance. But for his opponents, it was a public humiliation. Imagine an influential Athenian general, surrounded by a crowd of onlookers and adoring youths, forced to admit he can't clearly explain what courage is, or a poet who cannot account for the meaning of his own poems. Socrates acted like a surgeon, ruthlessly lancing the boils of self-satisfaction and false knowledge. He offered no ready answers. He only demolished the false ones. And therein lay his greatest danger to society. He wasn't building a new system of values. He was destroying faith in the old one, leaving behind intellectual ruins and a deep sense of confusion. And while the youth saw this as liberation, the older generation saw only nihilism and the destruction of their foundations. The paradox of Socrates' fate reaches its peak when we consider his political stance. The man whom democracy would sentence to death for subverting its foundations was, in fact, one of the few who showed true courage and loyalty to the law during the darkest hour of Athenian history. That hour came after the defeat in the Peloponnesian War, when in 404 BC, Sparta installed a puppet oligarchy in Athens, known to history by the bloody name, the Rule of the 30 Tyrants. At its head was Critias, a former associate of Socrates, and other aristocrats who unleashed a reign of terror, executing and exiling hundreds of citizens to seize their property. Democratic institutions were abolished, informants became the norm, and justice became a farce. In this atmosphere of universal fear, as many respected citizens either fled, fell silent, or collaborated, Socrates performed his first and perhaps greatest civic act. The tyrants, wanting to stain as many hands with blood as possible to ensure complicity, ordered Socrates and 4 others to sail to Salamis and arrest a man named Leon, a wealthy and respected citizen, to be unjustly tried and executed. It was a typical totalitarian test of loyalty through shared crime. The 4 men with Socrates obeyed and went to carry out the order. But Socrates, without saying a word, simply turned around and went home. He did not flee the city. He did not call for rebellion. He committed an act of passive noncompliance, knowing full well it could cost him his life. At his trial, he would say that his daimonion, his inner voice, had stopped him from committing an injustice. He was saved only because the regime of the 30 soon fell. This episode is irrefutable proof of his principles. He refused to obey tyranny, risking his own head. This makes it all the more bitter and ironic that just a few years later, the restored democracy would accuse this same man of anti-state activities. He who defied the tyrants was condemned by those who had remained silent or hidden under their rule. This shows his sentence was driven not by facts, but by fear and resentment, and that the crowd, whether democratic or oligarchic, is equally intolerant of a man of unbending conscience. To fully grasp the persistence that many Athenians mistook for arrogance, one must look into the most secret part of Socrates' soul, the home of his mysterious advisor, the daimonion. This phenomenon, which Socrates described as an inner voice or divine sign, had been with him since childhood. It's crucial to understand this was not like the voices of gods heard by epic heroes, calling them to action. Socrates' daimonion acted exclusively as a restraint, a kind of divine veto. It never told Socrates what to do, but it always warned him away from certain actions if they might lead to bad consequences or were inherently unjust. It was this voice, he said, that kept him out of political life, which in Athens was so toxic that an honest man could not survive in it long without compromising his principles. It was this voice that stopped him when the tyrants ordered the arrest of Leon of Salamis. For Socrates himself, this inner experience was proof of his special connection to the divine, a confirmation of his mission. But to his fellow citizens, it sounded strange at best, and blasphemous or dangerous at worst. The formal charge brought by Miletus included the line, "He introduces new gods." The daimonion was the chief piece of evidence. Athenian religion was deeply conservative and public. The gods were communal, patrons of the city, their cults and rituals strictly regulated. The appearance of a man claiming to have his own private divine advisor was seen as an attack on the entire religious system. It was like creating a private sect, a challenge to the Olympians. The accusers skillfully used this, presenting the daimonion as some new evil demon that Socrates was trying to place alongside Zeus and Athena. Thus, what for the philosopher was the highest expression of piety, obedience to a divine voice, became for the court proof of his impiety. This tragic gap in perception reveals the chasm between the inner world of a genius and the prejudices of the crowd. Socrates spoke of a personal spiritual experience, but Athens heard only heresy and a threat to its collective religious consciousness, which was already shattered by the trauma of war. The central charge, and the one that sparks the most debate today, was that Socrates corrupts the youth. To understand the power of this accusation, we must abandon modern connotations and see it through the eyes of a 5th century BC Athenian. Corruption, diaphtero, meant not so much sexual licentiousness as it meant moral decay, the destruction of authority, the injection of doubt into impressionable minds. And from that perspective, the accusation, paradoxically, was partly true. Socrates was indeed the epicenter of intellectual ferment among Athens's golden youth. The brightest, most ambitious, and most restless young men from the noblest families always swarmed around him. Among them were the future philosopher Plato, the future historian Xenophon, and the notoriously infamous Alcibiades and Critias. What drew them to this ugly old man in a tattered tunic? Not lectures, not ready-made knowledge. They were drawn by the spectacle. Like spectators at a gladiator match, they gathered to watch Socrates dissect the latest victim of his Elenchus. They saw the most respected politicians, their fathers, their mentors, rendered helpless by his barrage of questions. It was thrilling. It was subversive. In their eyes, Socrates was tearing down the adult world, a world of boring, hypocritical authorities. He taught them the most dangerous art of all, the art of critical thinking. He made them doubt everything: the justice of Athenian laws, the virtue of the generals, the wisdom of the poets, the piety of the priests. For young men whose fathers demanded unquestioning obedience to tradition, Socrates' philosophy was a breath of fresh air. But for those fathers, for Athenian society, it was a catastrophe. They saw their sons, after listening to Socrates, come home and argue with them at the dinner table, questioning family values and political beliefs. They saw in this the breakdown of the bond between generations, the foundation of any traditional society. Socrates, from their point of view, was poisoning the well of the future, turning obedient sons into arrogant cynics. So when the Athenians said corrupts, they meant something far more terrifying than just bad influence. They meant that Socrates was committing an act of intellectual patricide, dissolving the invisible glue of tradition and authority that held their city together. If the prosecution needed a living, breathing symbol of the youth corrupted by Socrates, they could not have found a better candidate than Alcibiades. This figure, brilliant, charismatic, immensely talented, and just as immensely unprincipled, was the shadow that haunted Socrates to the very end. Alcibiades embodied everything Athens both admired and feared: an aristocrat to the core, a handsome orator, a skilled general. He seemed blessed by all the gods. And this man had been one of Socrates' closest and most devoted companions in his youth. Their relationship was the subject of much gossip, but according to Plato's Symposium, Socrates was the only one who could tame Alcibiades' wild nature, appealing to his conscience and his desire for virtue. Socrates saw in him vast potential that could be directed for the good of Athens. However, history chose another path. Alcibiades chose the path of unbridled ambition. As a leading politician, he was the chief architect of the disastrous Sicilian expedition, which became the beginning of the end for the Athenian Empire. Just before it launched, he was accused of religious sacrilege, the mutilation of the Herms. Instead of facing trial, he fled and, in an unthinkable act, defected to the enemy, Sparta. He advised the Spartans on how best to fight his own city, inflicting colossal damage on Athens. Then he betrayed Sparta too, finding refuge with the Persians, the eternal enemies of Greece. His life was a series of brilliant maneuvers and monstrous betrayals. And for the average Athenian, who had lost sons and fortune in the war, the connection was simple and obvious. Alcibiades, the greatest traitor in Athenian history, was the student of Socrates. All his sophisticated arguments, his ability to manipulate a crowd, his cynical contempt for law and tradition, had he not learned this from his teacher? The prosecution never said Alcibiades' name aloud in court. An amnesty was in effect, forbidding old grievances. But his ghost haunted the room. Anytus and his allies skillfully played on this unhealed wound. They created an unspoken but powerful syllogism in the minds of the jury. Socrates taught Alcibiades. Alcibiades became a traitor. Therefore, the teachings of Socrates produced traitors. For a frightened and embittered people, this logic was devastating, and no philosophical counter-argument from Socrates could overcome it. If Alcibiades was the symbol of betrayal, Critias was the living embodiment of tyranny, one that seemed to Athenians to have grown out of Socratic conversations. Critias, Plato's uncle, was another significant figure from Socrates' circle. Unlike Alcibiades, he was less a man of action and more an intellectual, a sophist, a playwright. He also spent much time in conversation with Socrates, absorbing his dialectical method and his critical view of democracy. But while Socrates criticized democracy from a place of seeking true justice, Critias seems to have concluded in the superiority of the elite and the right of the strong. His hour struck after Athens' defeat. It was he who became the leader and ideologue of the pro-Spartan regime of the 30 tyrants, and his rule was marked by unprecedented cruelty. He didn't just eliminate political opponents. He instituted a system of terror aimed at all wealthy citizens in order to confiscate their property. By some estimates, in 8 months of his rule, some 1,500 people were executed, more than had died in the last 10 years of the war. Critias embodied the worst nightmare of any Greek, the philosopher turned tyrant. He used his sharp mind not to seek the good, but to justify violence and plunder. And again, as with Alcibiades, the shadow of Critias fell upon Socrates. The connection between them was undeniable. Athenians remembered them walking the agora together, locked in their endless disputes. And again, a deadly chain of logic formed in the jurors' minds. The philosophy of Socrates, with its critique of democracy and traditional gods, had created the ideological soil for tyranny. Didn't Socrates teach contempt for the opinion of the majority? Didn't he mock the casting of lots, the very basis of Athenian democracy? In his words, many now heard not a search for truth, but an elitist arrogance that, in practice, had turned into the bloody dictatorship of Critias. The fact that Socrates himself had refused to obey the tyrant's criminal order, risking his own life, was either forgotten or ignored. The emotional trauma inflicted by Critias's regime was too strong. To the Athenian people, Socrates had become the intellectual father of the two most hated figures of their recent past. And for the sins of his children, the teacher had to be held responsible. On the intellectual stage of Athens, Socrates had other opponents, not as bloody as Critias, but perhaps more influential in the long run. These were the sophists, wandering teachers of wisdom, who for a hefty fee taught young wealthy men the art of rhetoric and debate. Figures like Protagoras, Gorgias, and Hippias were the superstars of their time. They claimed they could teach anyone to succeed in politics and law, where the ability to persuade was key. Unlike Socrates, who sought universal, objective truth, the sophists adhered to relativism. Protagoras' famous maxim, "Man is the measure of all things," meant that absolute truth did not exist, only opinions, and the best argued opinion wins. Their goal was not truth, but victory in debate. They taught their students to make the weaker argument the stronger, essentially, to justify any position with rhetorical tricks. Socrates was their natural, irreconcilable enemy. His method was aimed precisely at exposing the emptiness of their eloquence. He considered them intellectual prostitutes, selling sham knowledge and truly corrupting the youth by teaching them not to seek virtue, but to chase success at any cost. Plato's dialogues constantly pit Socrates against various sophists, invariably showing his intellectual and moral superiority. But to the general public, the difference between Socrates and the sophists was not so clear. Both were masters of argument, both questioned traditional values. To the average Athenian, Socrates was just another sophist, only poorer and stranger. Aristophanes, in his comedy The Clouds, famously portrayed Socrates as a typical sophist who, for a fee, teaches how to dodge debts. This caricature, though unfair, was a huge hit and did irreparable damage to Socrates' reputation, creating the public image of a cunning atheist. Thus, while fighting the sophists on the philosophical front, Socrates paradoxically ended up in the same boat with them in the eyes of the crowd, which helped his enemies paint him as just another destroyer of morals, undermining the state. Every dialogue of Socrates, which for him was a step toward truth, often became a source of deep and lasting resentment for his partners in conversation. Picture the scene: an influential Athenian politician, accustomed to flattery and respect, is publicly shamed by some barefoot old man who, with a few questions, has shown everyone that this respected figure actually has no idea what he's talking about. Or a celebrated poet, whose tragedies are admired by the whole city, is forced to stammer when asked to explain the wisdom in his own verses. Socrates didn't just expose ignorance, he burst the bubbles of human vanity. And a wounded ego is one of the most powerful and vengeful forces in the world. Over his decades of philosophical activity, Socrates left a long trail of such offended and humiliated people. These were not just random passers-by. They were the pillars of Athenian society. Each one, defeated in argument, harbored a grudge. They couldn't forgive him, not because he was right, but because he made them look like fools in front of everyone, especially in front of the youth, their own sons. This army of hidden enemies was far more dangerous than his open opponents. They didn't engage him in new arguments. They waited for their moment to strike from the shadows. The trial in 399 BC became the perfect opportunity for them to settle scores. Many of the 501 jurors had likely either suffered his irony themselves or were friends and relatives of those he had refuted. Their vote was not so much a legal act as an act of revenge. They were punishing him for years of intellectual discomfort, for making them feel stupid and insecure. Socrates himself says this in his Apology, arguing he made many enemies precisely because, in fulfilling the god's will, he showed people their own ignorance. He knew full well he was being judged not for the official charges, but for his entire life, for his manner of being a gadfly on the body of the Athenian state. His wisdom, which should have inspired admiration, instead provoked only irritation and hatred, because it did not flatter, it wounded. The coalition that decided to destroy Socrates was represented by three figures, each symbolizing a layer of Athenian society he had offended. The formal accuser was Meletus, a young and, by all accounts, mediocre tragic poet. He was the face of the art world. Poets in Athens were considered not just creators, but bearers of traditional wisdom and morality. Socrates, however, repeatedly showed in his dialogues that poets create from inspiration, without rationally understanding their own work, all while claiming to possess comprehensive wisdom. For the poetic guild, this was an insult. Meletus, perhaps driven by personal grievance or a desire for fame, became the voice of this offended trade. The second figure was Lycon, a little-known orator. He represented the professional speakers, whose art of persuasion Socrates dismissed as a form of flattery, not a path to truth. Rhetoric was the foundation of the Athenian political and judicial system, and Socrates' criticism undermined the very prestige of the profession. Lycon likely embodied the outrage of those whose livelihood and reputation the philosopher had challenged. But the most important and influential figure behind the scenes was Anytus. He was no poet or orator, but a powerful and respected politician, a wealthy owner of tanneries, and a leader of the Democratic Party who had actively participated in overthrowing the 30 tyrants. Anytus was the embodiment of the Athenian establishment, a moderate democrat, a patriot, a man of action. His hatred for Socrates was deeply personal. According to one story, Anytus's son was among the young men who followed Socrates, and under the philosopher's influence, came to despise his father's trade. This led to family conflict, and some say, to the young man's ruin. Anytus saw Socrates as a destroyer of family foundations and the traditional order, where a son must respect and continue his father's work. He sincerely believed Socrates' philosophy was undermining the city's foundations. It was his political weight, his reputation, and his resources that turned this trial from a petty complaint into a matter of state importance. Meletus and Lycon were just pawns. The real director of the execution was Anytus, a man who saw Socrates as a mortal threat to the world he had built and defended. The first official charge, carved on a bronze plaque and displayed for all to see, read, "Socrates is guilty of not honoring the gods the city honors and of introducing other new divinities." This charge of accusations, or impiety, was extremely serious in Athens. Religion was not a private matter, but a public state cult that ensured the gods' protection and the city's prosperity. Any deviation from the established norms was seen as a threat to the entire community. But what, specifically, was Socrates' impiety? The accusers built their case on several pillars, skillfully mixing truth, half-truth, and outright slander. First, they used his philosophical method. Socrates constantly sought rational, universal definitions for concepts like justice, goodness, and virtue. He shifted the focus from traditional mythological explanations to human reason. For conservative Athenians, this was already suspicious. A man who tries to understand the will of the gods through logic, rather than rituals and divination, is already placing himself above the established order. Second, as mentioned, his talk of a personal daimonion was presented as proof of introducing new divinities. This was the most concrete and dangerous part of the charge, as it turned his private spiritual experience into an act of public heresy. The accusers ignored the fact that Socrates never called on anyone to worship his daimonion, and that he himself dutifully participated in all public religious ceremonies. Third, he was blamed for the influence of natural philosophers like Anaxagoras, who claimed the sun was not the god Helios, but a red-hot stone. Although Socrates himself criticized natural philosophy for being detached from human problems, in the public mind, thanks to Aristophanes' comedy, he was firmly associated with these godless teachings. The charge of impiety was the perfect tool for his enemies. It was vague enough to cover anything, yet it appealed to the deepest fears of the Athenians, who, after their defeat in the war, were inclined to believe their troubles were the result of the gods' anger, provoked precisely by smart men like Socrates. The second charge, corrupting the youth, was the emotional core of the entire trial. If the charge of impiety struck at religious sentiments, this one struck at the very heart of Athenian society, the family and the future of the city. As we've seen, corruption was understood not as physical abuse, but as intellectual subversion. In the eyes of accusers like Anytus, Socrates was committing several crimes at once. First, He undermined the authority of elders. By teaching young men to ask questions and take nothing on faith, he was, in effect, arming them against their own fathers. The traditional model of upbringing, based on respect for elders and unquestioning acceptance of their experience, was collapsing. A young man, returning home from a conversation with Socrates, might start arguing with his father about the nature of justice, questioning his life's principles. For the patriarchal society of Athens, this was unthinkable. Second, his philosophy devalued traditional education and values. A young Athenian from a good family was supposed to learn how to manage an estate, speak in the assembly, and fight in wars. Socrates, however, taught them that all this was meaningless without the main thing: knowing oneself and understanding what true good is. He turned them away from practical affairs, from careers, from service to the state, in favor of some vague philosophical quests. In the eyes of a pragmatic politician like Anytus, this wasn't just eccentricity. It was a criminal waste of human capital, a weakening of the state. Third, and most terrifyingly, his critical methods seemed to be creating a generation of nihilists. By destroying old definitions and offering no new ones, Socrates left his students in an intellectual vacuum. The Athenians saw the result of this education in the examples of Alcibiades and Critias, men who, having cast off old moral constraints, found no new ones and used their sharp minds to achieve selfish and criminal ends. Thus, the charge of corrupting the youth was, in essence, an accusation of murdering the future of Athens. Socrates was portrayed as an evil genius whose philosophy of doubt was breaking the spine of the new generation, making them incapable of believing, obeying, and defending their city. In the post-war atmosphere of instability, when unity and faith in traditional values seemed the only chance for survival, such activity truly looked like treason. The moment of truth arrived when Socrates was given the floor to defend himself. His speech, preserved in Plato's Apology, became not just a legal defense but one of the greatest philosophical manifestos in history. And it was this speech that turned a possible acquittal into an inevitable death sentence. Socrates made a fatal error from a legal standpoint, but remained completely true to himself as a philosopher. He didn't even try to speak the language of the court. Instead of appealing for mercy, flattering the jurors, or bringing in his weeping wife and children, as was customary, he decided to give them one last philosophy lesson. He began by dividing his accusers into old, those who had built his bad reputation for years, like Aristophanes, and new, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Then he methodically, point by point, demolished the official charges, using his trademark elenchus to publicly cross-examine Meletus and make him look like a complete fool. But the climax of his speech, the moment of his true hubris, arrogance that challenges fate, was his explanation of his own life. He told the story of the oracle, declaring that his entire life's work was not his own whim, but a service to the god Apollo. He compared himself to a gadfly, sent by the god to sting the lazy Athenian horse, to wake it up and keep it from getting fat. And then he spoke the words that sealed his fate. When discussing what penalty he deserved, he stated that for his many years of service to the city, he deserved not punishment, but the highest honor: free meals for life in the Prytaneion, a privilege reserved for Olympic champions and the greatest benefactors of Athens. To the 501 jurors, tired, irritated, and feeling insulted, this sounded like unheard-of arrogance. They might have been willing to show mercy to a repentant old man, but they were not prepared to be lectured on their own ignorance by a man who placed himself on par with heroes. This speech was an act of intellectual suicide. Socrates was not begging for his life. He was demanding they recognize his righteousness. And democracy, intolerant of anyone who considers himself superior, delivered its verdict. The Athenian court procedure involved 2 votes. The first determined guilt. Bronze tokens were dropped into 2 urns, one for solid, acquittal, one for hollow, conviction. When the votes were counted, the result was surprisingly close. 280 jurors found him guilty. 221 found him innocent. The gap was only 60 votes. If just 31 people had voted the other way, he would have been acquitted. This result shows that Athenian society was not monolithic in its hatred for Socrates. A significant portion, nearly half the jury, understood the absurdity of the charges, or at least did not consider his activities worthy of condemnation. Perhaps they saw him as an eccentric, a village idiot, but not a criminal. This moment was a critical crossroads. Socrates was found guilty, but the punishment was not yet set. He had a chance to save his life. Athenian law allowed the defendant, after a guilty verdict, to propose an alternative penalty to the death sought by the prosecution. It was a kind of plea bargain. They expected an appropriate offer, a large monetary fine, which his wealthy friends like Plato and Crito were ready to pay instantly, or, the most sensible option, exile from Athens. Either of these proposals would likely have been accepted by the jury. They had proven their point by finding him guilty. Now they could show mercy and rid the city of his presence without bloodshed. The entire hall waited. Socrates' friends were likely signaling him, begging him to be reasonable. But what happened next sealed his tragic fate. He took the floor again, and his choice was once again that of a philosopher, not a defendant. A second chance was given, and a second chance was rejected with even greater contempt than the first. Instead of proposing exile or a large fine, Socrates, true to his ironic nature, declared that since he had done nothing wrong, he could not assign himself a punishment. To assign himself a penalty would be to admit guilt, and he was innocent. Nevertheless, bowing to the law, he began to consider the options. Exile? No, he was too old to wander foreign cities, where he would likely meet the same fate, as he could never stop philosophizing. Prison? That is a slave's life. A fine? He had no money. Then, as if mocking the court, he offered to fine himself 1 mina, a laughably small sum. Only under pressure from his students, Plato, Crito, Critobulus, and Apollodorus, who vouched for him, did he reluctantly agree to raise the sum to 30 minae, a significant but manageable amount for his friends. But it was too late. This haggling, this philosophizing on the edge of the grave, was taken by the jury as the final, ultimate insult. They, the judges, the arbiters of justice, the representatives of the Athenian people, had been humiliated. The defendant was not only unrepentant, he was openly mocking them and the entire legal process. He was acting as if he were judging them, not the other way around. And the anger, which may have subsided after the first vote, flared up with new, uncontrollable force. Their patience snapped. Socrates had left them no choice. Anyone who had been undecided, anyone who had been inclined toward mercy, now saw only an arrogant old man who was practically begging to be killed. He refused to live on their terms, and they decided he would not live at all. The fatal act was done. The second vote began, this time not on guilt, but on the penalty. Death as proposed by Meletus, or the fine as proposed by Socrates. The result was a foregone conclusion. If the first vote had been close, now the scales tipped decisively. 360 jurors voted for the death penalty, 80 more than had originally found him guilty. This means that 80 jurors who had initially believed him innocent, now angered by his behavior, voted for his execution. This is the most tragic and telling moment of the trial. It shows that Socrates was executed not so much for his crimes as for his character, for his unbending defiance and his refusal to play by society's rules. He was condemned for who he was. When the sentence was announced, Socrates gave his final speech to the court. Again, there was no fear, no regret. He addressed those who voted for his death, predicting that after he was gone, they would be reproached by other, younger, and harsher critics, whom he had, until now, held back. He said they were wrong to think that by killing people, they could stop the criticism of their unjust lives. Then he turned to those who had voted to acquit him, his friends. He comforted them, saying that death may not be an evil, but a good, either a dreamless sleep or the soul's migration to a better world, where he could converse with the heroes and sages of the past. He noted that his daimonion had not stopped him once during the entire day, not when he went to court, nor when he gave his speech. This, he believed, meant that everything happening was for the best. His final words in court were filled with calm and majesty. But now it is time to go, I to die and you to live. Which of us goes to the better fate is known to no one but God. By Athenian law, the execution should have taken place immediately, the day after the sentencing. But fate granted Socrates 30 more days of life. By coincidence, on the eve of the trial, the sacred ship had been sent from Athens to the island of Delos, an annual mission honoring the mythical journey of Theseus, who saved the Athenian youths from the Minotaur. By ancient custom, from the moment the ship sailed until its return, the city had to remain pure, and all executions were forbidden. Due to unfavorable winds, the ship's journey was delayed for nearly a month. Thus, Socrates spent his last 30 days in the state prison, in shackles, but not alone. The prison became his final philosophical school. Every day, his loyal students and friends came to him. His old friend Crito, the young Phaedo, Critobulus, Apollodorus, and of course Plato, who would later immortalize these last days in his dialogues. The atmosphere Plato describes is astonishing. There was no despair, no fear, no curses against the judges. Socrates was perfectly calm, even cheerful. He continued to do what he had done his entire life. He held conversations. He discussed the nature of justice, the duty of a citizen, the laws, and most importantly, the immortality of the soul. The dialogue Phaedo, which is entirely dedicated to Socrates' last day, is a monumental attempt to prove with logical arguments that the soul does not die with the body, but is merely liberated from it, as from a prison. These final conversations became his philosophical testament. He wasn't just preparing for death, he was contemplating it, turning it from a tragic end into the logical conclusion of his life and teaching. He was showing his students, by his own example, that a true philosopher should not fear death, because his entire life is a preparation for it, for the soul's liberation from its bodily chains. The prison became the stage for his last and greatest lesson. An internal struggle tore at the hearts of Socrates' students. To see their teacher, the greatest sage, in chains, awaiting an unjust execution, was unbearable. They could not and would not accept the verdict. The most active among them was Crito, a wealthy and influential Athenian, Socrates' friend since childhood. He could not let his friend die. Using his money and connections, Crito developed a detailed escape plan. He had bribed the prison guards, found people to hide Socrates and arranged for his passage to Thessaly, where he could live peacefully and comfortably in exile. Everything was ready. One morning at dawn, Crito came to the prison to lay out the plan and convince Socrates to flee. This conversation, immortalized by Plato in the dialogue Crito, is one of the most tense and dramatic scenes in all of philosophy. Crito uses every possible argument. He appeals to their friendship, saying he will lose an irreplaceable friend, and he himself will be shamed. People will say he was too cheap to save Socrates. He appeals to fatherly duty, reminding Socrates he is abandoning his sons as orphans, condemning them to a miserable existence. He appeals to common sense, arguing that to refuse escape when it's possible is to play into his enemy's hands, to commit the same injustice against himself that they committed against him. Crito's arguments were strong, logical, and filled with sincere love and concern. He spoke for the whole world, for normal human feelings, the instinct for self-preservation, duty to family, fear of death. He offered Socrates a simple, clear choice: a shameful death or a dignified life in exile. For any other person, the choice would have been obvious, but Socrates was not any other person. Socrates' answer to Crito became the culmination of his teaching on civic duty and justice. He didn't argue with Crito directly. Instead, he used his favorite device, an imaginary dialogue. He asked Crito to imagine that, just as they are preparing to escape, the laws and the state of Athens themselves appear and address him, Socrates, with a speech. This device allowed him to shift the conversation from the personal level, friendship, children, to the universal philosophical level, the relationship between a citizen and the state. And so these personified laws ask him a series of devastating questions. "Tell us, Socrates," they say, "what are you planning to do? By this act, are you not intending to destroy us, the laws, and the entire state, as far as it is in your power? Do you think a state can still exist and not be overthrown, in which the legal judgments have no force, but are nullified and destroyed by private individuals?" The laws remind Socrates that he was born, raised, educated, and lived his entire life under their protection. He was not a slave. He could have, upon reaching adulthood, taken his property and left for any other city if he disliked the laws of Athens. But he did not. He stayed in Athens, thereby making an unspoken contract with the laws to obey them. He lived in Athens for 70 years, almost never leaving the city, which proves he was satisfied with its order. And now, when the laws, through a legal court procedure, have passed a sentence on him, even an unjust one, does he have the right to break that contract? To answer injustice with injustice is a path unworthy of a philosopher. To escape is not just to save one's life. It is an act that destroys the very principle of the rule of law. If every citizen feels he has the right to disobey laws he finds unjust, then nothing will be left of the state but chaos. Thus, Socrates led Crito and himself to an inescapable conclusion. His duty as a citizen was to submit to the sentence. In this decision to refuse escape, the full depth and tragedy of the central paradox is revealed. Socrates becomes a voluntary victim in the name of the very principle that is killing him. He, accused of subverting the state, proves to be its most consistent and faithful defender. His choice is not passive submission to fate, but the highest act of philosophical and civic courage. He distinguishes between the injustice of a specific court ruling and the justice of the institution of law itself. The people, the jurors, Anytus, Meletus, may be wrong, Their decision may be based on envy, ignorance, and fear, but the principle itself, that a citizen must obey the laws of his city, is, for Socrates, sacred. To destroy that principle to save his own life would be to betray everything he taught. It would be to admit that his philosophy was just empty talk, to be abandoned in the face of death. By refusing to flee, Socrates turns his death from a defeat into a victory. He shows that his commitment to justice is not just a theoretical argument, but a life principle for which he is willing to die. He becomes a martyr, not only for philosophy, but for the very idea of a civil society based on the rule of law. This is his greatest paradox. He obeys an unjust sentence in order to affirm the idea of justice. He dies at the hands of democracy to prove his loyalty to the ideals of the city, even as that city proved blind and cruel. This final act turns his biography into a complete philosophical work, where life and death are inseparable from his teaching. He didn't just talk about how to live, he showed how to die, and in doing so secured his own immortality. The execution of their teacher was not just a personal tragedy for his students, it was an intellectual catastrophe that forever changed the trajectory of Western thought. The most significant figure among them was without a doubt Plato. For him, Socrates' death was not just a legal mistake. It was proof that democracy as a form of government is fundamentally flawed. How can a system be just if it allows a mob of ignorant people, easily manipulated by demagogues, to legally kill the wisest and most just man? This event created in Plato's soul a deep disillusionment and mistrust of the demos, the people, as a source of power. His entire subsequent political philosophy, laid out in The Republic, Statesman, and Laws, is essentially an attempt to answer the accursed question: how to build a state where a Socrates will not be executed, but will rule. His answer was radical and anti-democratic. Plato's ideal state is a rigid hierarchy, ruled not by the people, but by a caste of philosopher kings, men who, through years of training and asceticism, have come to understand the world of ideas and the idea of the good. In this state, there is no place for freedom of speech, as Athens knew it. Poets are exiled, and the entire life of the citizens is subordinated to a single goal: achieving justice as the philosophers understand it. Thus, the execution of Socrates, carried out in the name of protecting democracy, paradoxically gave birth to the most powerful and influential anti-democratic utopia in history. For Plato, Socrates' death was the original sin of democracy, its indelible stain. He dedicated his entire life to creating a philosophical system that would make the repetition of such a tragedy impossible. And although the 20th century showed how dangerous such utopian projects can be, there is no denying that it was this tragic impulse, born at the foot of the Athenian court, that became the source of one of the greatest intellectual movements in human history. At his trial, Socrates used a metaphor that best describes his role in Athens and the reason for his death. "If you kill me," he told the jurors, "you will not easily find another like me, who, to use a rather absurd comparison, has been attached to the city by the god, as if to a horse that is large and noble, but rather sluggish from its size, and in need of being stirred up by a gadfly." This image is brilliant in its simplicity and accuracy. Athens is the noble but lazy horse, wallowing in self-satisfaction, accustomed to its former glory. Socrates is the small, annoying, painfully biting gadfly, sent by the god himself to keep this horse from sleeping, to constantly wake it, to force it to move, to think, to live up to its noble lineage. His endless questions, his irony, his refutations, These are the bites of the gadfly. They are painful, they are irritating, they give no peace. But they are necessary to keep the horse from becoming a lifeless carcass, to keep it alive and energetic. This metaphor explains both the love of the youth for him, they saw in him energy, an awakening, and the hatred of the establishment. No one likes to be painfully bitten and woken up. The execution of Socrates, in this logic, is the horse's natural reaction. Tired of the constant irritation, it does what any horse would do. It swats its tail and kills the annoying insect. It's an instinctive movement that brings instant relief. The horse can now doze peacefully in its stall again. But this relief is illusory. By killing the gadfly, Athens rid itself of an irritant, but it also lost its only stimulus for self-analysis and growth. They chose the comfort of ignorance over the painful work of thinking. In this sense, the execution of Socrates became a symbolic act of intellectual suicide by an entire city. They destroyed their conscience, their inner critic. And although Athenian culture endured for a long time after, that inner fire, that passion for the ruthless search for truth that Socrates embodied, was extinguished. The horse fell into a slumber that eventually led to its loss of independence and its transformation into a provincial town in the backwaters of the Roman Empire. The day of execution arrived. The sun rose over Athens. The ship from Delos had returned to the port. The ban on executions was lifted. Socrates' friends came to the prison to say goodbye. He spent the entire day in conversation with them, discussing the immortality of the soul. As the sun began to set, a prison officer came in. With tears in his eyes, he told Socrates he was the noblest man who had ever entered this place, and asked him not to be angry, as he was only following orders. Then, the cup of poison was brought, a tincture of hemlock, which caused a gradual paralysis, rising from the extremities to the heart. The scene, described by Plato in the Phaedo, is filled with incredible dramatic power. Socrates, his expression unchanged, without a shudder, calmly took the cup, made a libation to the gods, and drank it in one draught. His students, who had held back until that moment, could no longer contain themselves and burst into tears. Apollodorus cried out loud, but Socrates reprimanded them. "What is this strange behavior? It is mainly for this reason I sent the women away, so they would not misbehave in this way." He asked them to be calm. He got up and began to walk around the cell, as the executioner had instructed, until he felt his legs grow heavy. Then he lay down on his back. The poison slowly rose through his body. He felt his feet and shins grow cold. At that moment, he transformed his death from a shameful execution into a triumph. He accepted the cup of hemlock not as a punishment, but as a cup of medicine, as a liberation. His calm, his self-possession in his final moments became the most powerful argument for his entire teaching. He showed that the philosopher who has glimpsed the truth truly does not fear death. Thus, the act that was meant to destroy him and cast him into oblivion became the act of his apotheosis, his transformation from a mortal man into an immortal symbol. The cup of poison in his hand became the cup of immortality, securing his eternal life in the memory of humankind. Death had already almost taken his body. The cold was nearing his heart. He lay, his face covered. And at that very last moment, he suddenly uncovered his face and spoke his final mysterious words, addressed to his friend. "Crato, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please pay the debt, and do not forget." After that, he spoke no more. These words became his final philosophical riddle, over which interpreters have puzzled for centuries. Asclepius was the god of healing. It was customary for Greeks who had recovered from an illness to sacrifice a rooster to him in thanks. What did Socrates mean? The most common and beautiful interpretation is that he viewed life in the body as a chronic illness and death as the cure. His soul was finally being liberated from the shackles of its mortal body, from its passions, needs, and limitations, and was passing into the world of pure thought. Therefore, like a patient who has recovered, he must thank the God of healing for the cure. His death was not a tragedy, but a recovery. This is a final, ironic, and profound thought, completing a life that was itself a constant search for the healing of the soul through knowledge. Others see a more complex meaning. Perhaps it was a reference to some unfulfilled vow, and Socrates, even on the threshold of death, is concerned with fulfilling all his earthly obligations, showing his commitment to duty to the very end. Some versions suggest it was a final piece of irony, understood only by his inner circle. But whatever the true answer, these words perfectly complete his image. He leaves this life not with curses or complaints, but with a thought of sacred duty, of order, of the transition to another state. His death, like his life, becomes a philosophical act, a thesis he proves to his final breath. He does not just die. He completes his journey, closing the circle and turning his biography into a perfect work of art. The death of Socrates instantly transformed him from a controversial city character, an Athenian eccentric, into the founding father and first martyr of all Western philosophy. His execution became the Big Bang, from which numerous philosophical schools were born. His students spread his legacy throughout the Greek world. Plato founded his academy, where he developed Socrates' ideas into a grand metaphysical system. Aristotle, Plato's student, became the tutor of Alexander the Great and the systematizer of virtually all ancient knowledge. The Cynics, like Diogenes, took Socrates' asceticism and contempt for convention to the extreme. The Cyrenaics, conversely, developed the idea of pleasure as the highest good. All of them, in one way or another, emerged from under Socrates' cloak. He became for them the eternal ideal of the philosopher, a man whose life is inseparable from his teaching, who is willing to die for his beliefs. However, his image was twofold from the very beginning. For some, starting with Plato, he is a saint, a sage, the ideal citizen, unjustly condemned by an ignorant mob. This is the image that dominates our culture. But there was another view. For his contemporary opponents, and later for critics like Nietzsche, Socrates was a destructive figure. He was the one who, with his rational poison, destroyed the healthy, instinctive, tragic culture of old Greece. He was, in Nietzsche's view, the precursor to the theoretical man, who believes the world can be understood and corrected by reason, and in doing so, killed the spirit of Dionysus, the spirit of tragedy. This duality persists today. Is Socrates the symbol of supreme intellectual courage, the father of the critical thinking that is essential to modern science and democracy? Or is he the eternal image of the smart aleck, who, with his endless doubting, undermines the foundations of society, faith, and tradition, ultimately leading to chaos and nihilism? This debate is eternal because it reflects a fundamental tension within human civilization itself. And so, we return to the main question, to the paradox that sounded at the very beginning. Why was the wisest man executed for corrupting the youth? Now, having walked his entire path, we can give a final layered answer. Socrates was not executed for the formal charges of impiety and corruption. He was executed because his wisdom was uncomfortable, aggressive, and ruthless. He was a living mirror, which he held up to the face of every Athenian and to Athenian society as a whole. And in that mirror, a traumatized, defeated, and insecure city saw not its former glory, but its present ugliness, the ignorance of its politicians, the emptiness of its poets, the hypocrisy of its virtuous citizens. They also saw their own monsters in that mirror, the brilliant traitor Alcibiades and the cruel tyrant Critias, who had been his pupils, and instead of trying to change the ugly face, they decided to shatter the mirror. Corrupting the youth was just a euphemism, a convenient label for Socrates' true crime. He taught the new generation how to use that mirror. He taught them to see the truth. And for a society built on convenient myths and unspoken agreements, there is nothing more dangerous than a man who demands that everyone account for their words and actions. He was executed not because he was an enemy of democracy, but because he demanded the impossible from democracy, that it be consistent, rational, and just. He was executed because his intellectual honesty was an unbearable reproach to their intellectual laziness. Ultimately, the verdict against Socrates is the triumph of humanity's fear of the truth. It is the eternal story of how a society, craving stability, prefers to kill the prophet rather than listen to his bitter words. His wisdom was poison to their illusions, and so they made him drink poison in reality. The story of Socrates is not just a drama played out in Athens in 399 BC. It is an eternal parable, a universal myth about the fate of the thinker in a world of the crowd. The trial of Socrates did not end with his death. It continues in every generation, in every culture that faces the choice between the comfort of established dogmas and the restless freedom of critical thought. Every time a society silences an inconvenient voice that asks too many questions, every time power persecutes a scientist, an artist, or a journalist for dissent, every time the majority declares an enemy anyone who dares to doubt its sacred cows, Socrates is once again in the dock, and the cup of hemlock is offered to him again and again. His story confronts us with eternal, unanswerable questions. Where is the line between vital critique and destructive nihilism? Does society have the right to protect its foundations from those who see them as mere prejudice? And what price are we willing to pay for freedom of thought? Socrates left us no answers. He left us only his method, the method of the eternal question. And perhaps this is his greatest lesson. The value of a human life is defined not by possessing the truth, but by the endless, courageous, and honest pursuit of it, even if that pursuit leads to the scaffold. He lost his trial in Athens, but he won the trial of history, forever remaining in our memory as the gadfly of humanity, who keeps us from falling asleep in the drowsiness of self-satisfaction and forces us to remember that the unexamined life is not worth living.